welcome all of you, to what turned out, we had to actually count this yesterday. It's our 8th annual conference. We're thrilled to be back here in Missoula. We've got a great lineup for you, and I'm going to ask Teresa to come up in a little bit to go over some of the highlights. I wanted to first just acknowledge all of you. We've had people, our membership continues to grow. Brad is great at giving me a down to the minute count, and we're at 558 members. There may be some that have joined us just this morning. We're the largest state nonprofit association in the country on a per capita basis. Thank you to all of you for that. I also want to acknowledge there's people that have come far and wide to be here for the next couple of days. We've got attendees that have come from Glendive, Roundup, Eureka, Broadus, Poplar, Browning. Of course, we've got great representation for what our governor has coined the boot. And finally, just acknowledge all of you from this hometown community, Missoula, for being with us the next couple days. Thank you for being here. This year's event also has been a couple milestones. We've got, I haven't counted, but given all the panels we have this year, we've got more speakers than I think we ever had. We probably have more consultants working than we've ever had. I know we have more exhibitors than we ever had. And I also know that we'll see how the numbers shape up, but I think our attendance is going to be pretty high this year as well. So real pleased about that. Also especially pleased to have such great support and involvement from the foundation community, both in Montana and regionally this year. Sue Bennett, who's sitting here up front, is here from Philanthropy Northwest. That's been real great this has been a tough year for all of us, we know, as nonprofits and as foundations, and it's great to see those to come together here at this conference. I want to take just a couple minutes to acknowledge our sponsors. As you know, this kind of event takes a lot of planning and coordination, and it certainly takes resources too. We've had very generous support over the years for this event. Our platinum sponsors, first of all, Quest, which has been with us for a long time. Dave Gibson, the Montana State President, thank you to Quest. Montana Community Foundation, is Linda in the room? Linda Reed? Kathy Cooney. The Montana Community Foundation has also been a big supporter of this event for quite some time, thank you. The Governor's Office of Community Service, is Jan Lombardi in the room? I saw, there she is. Thank you, Jan, for being a big supporter of this event. Also, we've got a hometown sponsor that's been with us for a number of years too, and that is the University of Montana. I'm going to ask John Tompkins to come up here. John is, I've talked to John on the phone a number of times over the last 7 or 8 years. This is the first time I actually got a chance to meet him. He's the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and the Chair for the American Humanics Nonprofit Leadership Advisory Committee. And they've been doing a lot of work over the years on helping students prepare for work and life within the nonprofit sector. So I'm going to ask John to come up and say a few words.
Good morning. On behalf of the University of Montana, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this annual statewide conference. I must say that I really like your theme this year, the idea of connections. We like to think at the university that we're working hard to connect students with their futures, helping them perhaps finding their unique place in society, helping them to find the way that they can make their most meaningful contributions. And I really think more and more students are going to be finding their place in the nonprofit sector. And we at the university are very proud to have worked with you in that movement with the help of Brian and under the leadership of Andrea Vernon in our office of, what's the name of it? Office for Civic Engagement. I choked there for a second. A few years ago, working with Brian and Andrea, we developed an academic minor in nonprofit administration. More recently, we introduced a professional certificate program online in nonprofit administration. And right now, as we speak, we're experimenting with the idea of seminars, big question seminars for entering freshmen that might focus on things like how can we have so much poverty in a land of plenty? And we're hoping that some of those seminars will introduce service learning components so that the students, starting right off at the freshman level, can work directly with you, with your nonprofit associations, to learn from experience as well as learning from the classroom. So we're very excited about all of this, and we look forward to connecting with you as much as we can in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'll add, a big thank you to President George Dennison. He's been a huge supporter of nonprofit organizations over the years, and really a leader in this state, and frankly, I'll say across the country in civic engagement. He's been the chair, I think. Jan, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think from the very start of the Montana Commission on Community Service, and has really been behind these efforts. So we're very pleased to have the University of Montana as a sponsor again this year. A list of other sponsors that I definitely want to recognize. Our gold sponsors: First Interstate Bank System Foundation, OP&W Edwards Foundation. Our silver sponsors: Anderson Zermulin, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Montana, Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, First Nonprofit Companies, Junkmere, Clark, Campanella, and Stevens, otherwise known as JCCS, Monitor Liability Managers, Mountain Sky Guest Ranch, Yellowstone Boys and Girls Ranch Foundation. And finally, our bronze sponsors, we want to thank as well: the Association of Fundraising Professionals, the Montana chapter, Alps Foundation Services, Charlotte Martin Foundation, Gallatin Public Affairs, High Stakes Foundation, Montana Correctional Enterprises, Mountain West Benefits, Office for Civic Engagement at the University of Montana, the Oro y Plata Foundation, and the Western Montana Fundraisers Association. Please join me in saying thank you to these sponsors. Before I turn it over to Teresa, I just wanted to acknowledge as well that some of you may not be here without the scholarship support from our platinum and gold sponsors, who also generously donated scholarship opportunities to make this conference available to some who may not otherwise be able to make it. So thank you to our gold and platinum sponsors for that important benefit as well. So on with the show. For those of you who have been here before, you know that we like to start our conference with a keynote speaker that can not only help frame our conference, but also set the tone, and in most years, inspire us as well. This year is no different. About the time we were thinking about a theme for the conference, which ended up being connections, you'll see throughout the whole 2.5 days, opportunities to explore collaboration, to hear about great collaborations. As we were thinking about the theme, was the same time that I happened to be reading this book called Forces for Good. And I can tell you, I do a lot of, I'm strange, like I don't read a lot of just personal other stuff. I read this stuff at night because I love it. But what I'll say is it's one of the best nonprofit leadership books that I've read in the last 20 years or so. It also says a lot about connecting. And so as we were thinking about theme and came up with connections, I said, I've got our speaker, Heather McLeod Grant. So we're very pleased to have Heather with us today to kick off our conference. She's a published author, speaker, and advisor to high-impact organizations. She recently joined the Monitor Institute as a senior consultant. As I mentioned, she's a co-author of Forces for Good, the 6 Practices of High-Impact Nonprofits, which was named a top 10 book of 2007 by The Economist. She's a former McKinsey company consultant. She also teaches at Stanford University in nonprofit leadership, strategic philanthropy, in social entrepreneurship. I can't think of a better person to have here today with us to kick off our conference, to frame the conference theme of connections, and to inspire all of you to work together. Please join me in welcoming Heather McLeod Grant.
Thank you, Brian. And I want to really thank the Montana Nonprofit Association for having me here today to talk to you a little bit about what my co-author Leslie and I have learned about what it takes to become a high-performing nonprofit organization. When I was chatting with Brian and Teresa earlier this morning, they were asking me if I had been to Montana before. And I said, yes, but it's been a very long time. The last time I was in Montana was when I was in 9th grade. and I played clarinet in marching band. This is not on my resume anymore, trust me. And we had won the state championship in California, so we had an opportunity as the marching band from Clovis, California, a suburb of Fresno, for anybody who knows where Fresno is, to go to Wisconsin and participate in marching band nationals. So we had this amazing 2-week journey across America with like several hundred kids and all their band instruments and lots of band parents along to make sure we didn't all get into trouble. And we drove through Montana and camped out in Yellowstone on the way back. So it's nice to be back after 25 some years. And the one other thing I was thinking about when I came to Montana was that when I went from Fresno off to Harvard, which was a big culture shock, trust me. And when I was at Harvard, I met a young woman named Amy McNamer. And I don't know if there's anybody here from Billings, but there's this family in Billings called the McNamers. And they are all tremendous. They're 5 kids. They all went from Billings to Harvard, and they all work in public service. Bridget works at the Skoll Foundation, funding social entrepreneurs around the world. Her brother Bruce runs TechnoServe, an organization bringing technology into Africa and developing countries. It's an amazing family. So in my mind, I've always thought of Montana as this fertile breeding ground for nonprofit leaders. So I'm delighted to be among many nonprofit leaders here today. Let me start by just telling you a little bit about the journey Leslie and I went on when we decided to write this book. It started really back about 5 years ago now. The book actually came out about 2 years ago. Leslie and I had both gone to Harvard undergrad and started a nonprofit magazine right out of college called Who Cares? It was targeting Gen Xers and designed to get young people engaged in community service and volunteering. And like I say, like many good activists in our generation, rather than sort of going out and doing community organizing or marching in the street, we went back to business school to get our MBAs. So I went off to Stanford, Leslie went back to Harvard for business school, and we were both working in the sector after business school and quite frustrated that here we'd gone and read all these great case studies of amazing businesses. You know, we were huge devotees of Jim Collins, Good to Great and Built to Last. And there were a number of books and cases written about high-performing businesses, what it takes to be great. And yet nobody had done that kind of research in the social sector. You know, there were books on how to do fundraising or how to build your board, but nobody had actually gone out and studied the best nonprofits and tried to figure out what makes them tick, what makes them so phenomenal. So that was really the impetus for our research. Leslie was working at Ashoka. I got a fellowship through Duke University Center for Social Entrepreneurship, and we really embarked on this journey of asking the question, what makes great nonprofits great? We suspected that it might be slightly different than what makes great businesses great. We went out, of course, the first challenge in researching the book was deciding who are the great nonprofits. You know, we joke that Jim Collins had it easy, because if you want to know who the great businesses are, you just look at their profitability or their stock market performance, right? Not so easy in our sector. We don't have a single agreed upon metric of what it means to succeed. And if you're working in the arts or you're working in environment or you're working in education, what you're measuring is going to be very different in terms of your outcomes and your results. We don't have profit as the sort of standard bottom line. So we actually did a survey of executive directors all over the country. We asked 3,000 executive directors of small, medium, and large nonprofits to tell us who within your field has had the biggest results in the last 20 to 30 years. We got hundreds of nominations, which we then spent 9 months vetting and putting through a whole series of due diligence tests to make sure they really had truly had significant outcomes in their field. We ended up picking 12 organizations that we spent 2 years studying, doing in-depth case study research. Now, we deliberately picked organizations across a number of fields because, again, we didn't want to just study what made great arts organizations great, for example. We wanted to understand really across all these issue areas, were there any common themes about the best performing nonprofits? So if you see up here, a wide range of organizations, all of them founded since the late 1960s or more recently. We wanted to know what it took to go from zero to great within a pretty short period of time, within 20 to 30 years. So we really only looked at organizations founded post-civil rights era. We weren't looking at the YMCAs and the United Ways and the organizations that have been around for a very long time. We've said that's another book, that's built to last for nonprofits. And we might write that one at some point. But you can see there's a number of groups up here in the youth field, in hunger relief, housing, community service, politics, and so on, and a broad range on the political spectrum as well. We have everything from the Heritage Foundation on the conservative right to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities on the left. And I suspect there might even be, America's Second Harvest is now called Feeding America. At the time we did the research, they were called America's Second Harvest, but I suspect there might even be some food banks or Habitat affiliates in the room because they're very much all over the country in many communities. Just to give you a quick snapshot of what their growth trajectories look like in terms of their budget. This is the budget growth of these organizations. As you can see, they all started out small and tiny with the seed of an idea, a couple $100,000 in budget max, and they all grew to about, and on average, about $40 million in budget. Some of them are now up to $100 million in budget. And Habitat is not even on this chart because they have $1 billion globally, so they would actually dwarf the entire scale. The red line up here actually represents the average, sort of the top 10% of nonprofits in this country, which get to $5 million in budget. I think this is a really important point because only 10% of nonprofits ever get above $5 million. And in fact, 80% of nonprofits are operating at $1 million or less, which I suspect is the case for many of you in this room. And so when we're out speaking about the book, a lot of people ask, well, you looked at these organizations with $30 or $40 million, how does that apply to me? Well, as we've gone around and talked to nonprofits all over the country, we've heard countless stories of local organizations taking these practices and applying them locally. It's not just about getting big, it's about how do you improve your performance and how do you improve your outcomes and your results. How do you have more impact with the resources you have? And on that point, I want to emphasize that we didn't pick these organizations because they were big, although one of our criteria was they had to have reached a level of national or international scale, but we didn't pick them on their budget size. We actually picked them on the impact that they were having. That was the key criteria. So if you actually look at what these organizations are accomplishing, it's pretty phenomenal. Feeding America distributes 2 billion pounds of food every year to feed 25 million hungry Americans through their network of more than 50,000 grassroots nonprofit organizations and 250 food banks. Self-Help Credit Union, an organization I'll tell a story about in just a minute, based in North Carolina, has distributed more than $4.5 billion in loans to low-income families and businesses to help them buy their first home or to build a business and to develop economic assets in their communities. Habitat, we've all heard of Habitat. Their brand is valued on par with that of Starbucks, so they're an incredibly well-known organization. They've built 275,000 homes, and they've mobilized almost 1 million volunteers. The Exploratorium, which is in San Francisco, where I live, is an interactive science museum, and they actually spurred the whole movement towards interactive museums. So anybody who's ever been to a children's museum or a science museum in your community, their model was very much influenced by the model of the Exploratorium, even though the Exploratorium's only in one location. They actually shared their model globally because they wanted to create this whole movement of making science and math an interactive and fun learning experience. And Environmental Defense, which is in New York City, has 500,000 members, but they've also been real pioneers in developing new legislation around cap and trade. So they've been real leaders in the environmental field in terms of coming up with new ways to solve problems like global warming and climate change. So how did they do this? And what can you learn from them that you can take back to your own community? Not necessarily about scaling up, but about having more impact and going deep in your community. Let me start by telling you a couple of stories of some of my favorites in the book. City Year is a youth organization that was started in the late 1980s, 1988, 89, by 2 Harvard Law School graduates, Michael Brown and Alan Casey, and they had this vision of national service. They had a vision that one day every young person in America would have the opportunity to serve their community, not by going to Iraq or performing in the military service, but giving back locally and making a difference on issues like the achievement gap in schools. They brought together deliberately diverse groups of young people aged 18 to 25. So they had Ivy League graduates with high school dropouts from inner city rural areas, or from inner city and rural areas. And they put them together in a youth corps for a year where they would spend the entire year serving their community. Well, from the outset, Alan and Michael had a big vision, and a vision that involved getting the government to fund more national service and to actually make this part of national policy. They also had a vision for getting the private sector involved. So when they first started out, they actually went to Timberland Corporation, and asked Jeff Schwartz, the CEO of Timberland, if he would donate boots for their first service corps. Well, anybody who's read the City Year story knows that not only did he donate boots, but he went on to donate boots for the entire Corps. He went on to donate the uniforms, and every year Timberland is the outfitter who provides all of City Year's uniforms. You can see their bright red jackets are part of their kind of traditional brand trademark, and in San Jose, where I live, they have to wear yellow jackets because red is a gang color. But Jeff Schwartz joined the board of City Year, and over the last 20 years, Timberland Company alone has given more than $50 million to support City Year and national service. That's just one company. City Year has more than 100 corporate partners. And in addition to engaging the private sector so actively in their work, they also really engaged government. As I said, they had this idea that national service was a concept that shouldn't just be for young people who could join City Year, but for every young person in the country. So when a guy named Bill Clinton was running for president way back in 1992, he stopped by City Year and said, if I'm elected, I'm going to turn this into a national program. Well, we all know how that turned out. He got in, he passed the National Community Service Act, and AmeriCorps was born. And it has now just recently doubled in size under the new Ted Kennedy Learn and Serve America Act. So through this program, this government program, hundreds of millions of dollars have been leveraged that fund not just City Year. Yes, it has benefited City Year. They're in 17 sites around the country, but that support nonprofit community service agencies all over the country. And I saw out here the governor's table that I know that the Montana Community Service Organization is here today as well. Teach for America is another inspiring story of a young social entrepreneur. Wendy Kopp was actually a senior at Princeton when she wrote her thesis on the idea, very similar to City Year in some ways, the idea of a national service corps modeled on Peace Corps, but rather than sending young people abroad, she said, why don't we get them to work in our schools here? Because we have so many needs in America that are unmet. So she took young college graduates and placed them in America's neediest schools, urban and rural, the ones with the biggest achievement gaps, the hardest problem recruiting and retaining teachers. And when she wrote her thesis, she told her thesis advisor, I want to actually start this organization. I want to turn this into a reality. And of course, he told her she was crazy, and what did she know about running a national nonprofit organization? She was only 20 years old. Well, Wendy Kopp, being a good social entrepreneur, persevered. She got donated office space in New York City. She hired a bunch of her friends, and they launched back in 1990-91. The first Teach for America Corps was up and running. Now, they had some bumps along the road. Around year 4, the organization almost went under. Everybody was being paid $20,000. There was no management structure. It was a bunch of recent college graduates who were running on idealism and caffeine. And at one point, Wendy Kopp had to raise $700,000 in 2 weeks, or she was going to have to shut the organization down. Can you imagine $700,000 in 2 weeks? It was at that point that she began sleeping every other night, which I like to say is not really a sustainable leadership practice. Works when you're 22 maybe, but gets a little harder after that. But they got some help and they persevered, and now Teach for America has gone on to become a real force for education reform in this country. And what's interesting is people sometimes, Teach for America, like many big nonprofits, has had some of its critics who look at, what happens in the classroom, and they say, well, your teachers, only 60% of them stay in the classroom, 40% leave after 2 years. But what's phenomenal about Teach for America, it's not just what happens in the classroom. It's actually the fact that they have created a whole vanguard for education reform in this country. It's what happens to those teachers in those 2 years that they spend teaching these kids. They become lifelong converts to the concept of education reform, and they become passionate advocates. So whether they go into business, or they go into philanthropy, or they go into government, or they stay in the classroom, they are lifelong advocates for education reform. So if you look at Teach for America today, in fact, not only do they have more than 5,000 teachers going through the program every 2 years, but if you look at where their alumni are, they're running some of the most powerful foundations for education reform in this country. The Eli Broad Foundation in Los Angeles, the New Schools Venture Fund in Silicon Valley that has raised more than $100 million for education reform. The founders of KIPP Academy, the Knowledge is Power Charter Schools program, are Teach for America alums. And Michelle Reed, the Chancellor of DC Public Schools, is a Teach for America alum. So what we like to say is that Teach for America's impact has been much more indirect and over time, but they have built this whole movement for education reform in this country. And that leads me to sort of the big aha in our research and what we found that all of these organizations have in common. That is, they don't just build their organization, they actually figure out how to build a movement and connect and engage all of the sectors in their work so that they could have significantly more impact than what they could do with just their own staff or employees alone. So in fact, as I mentioned, in the case of both Teach for America and City Year and all of these organizations, they actively engage all 4 sectors in their work. They engage the government, they engage business, they engage nonprofits, and they actively engage and inspire large networks of individuals. Now, when Les and I started out doing this research, we went in with our MBA hats on, and we didn't think this is what we would find. In fact, we had some hypotheses about what we thought we would find in great nonprofits. We thought great nonprofits, well, they're all going to have huge budgets. Certainly, some of them do have very large budgets, but the range was from $10 million to $1 billion. That's a pretty big difference, and yet they're all having significant impact with the resources they have. We thought they'd all have global brands like Habitat, but some of these organizations that we were researching, like Youth Build is in 226 sites in America, serving more than 60,000 needy young people, high school dropouts every single year. Nobody's heard of them because they don't even have a marketing person. They're not very good at building their brand, but they're having significant impact on the ground. Or perfect mission statements. I venture to guess that many of you in this room have spent hours in a conference room with your board and your strategic planning committee working on wordsmithing your mission statement, right? Talking about, well, we need a verb, or, let's change happy to glad. In fact, these organizations don't all have perfect mission statements. It's more about how they live and breathe their mission every day, not about the words on paper. Or board governance. I'll talk about board governance in a minute. Or even high charity ratings. In fact, none of our hypotheses, as we got into the data and the research, none of our hypotheses were holding up. So that's at the point when we scratched our heads and said, well, what is it about these organizations? And that's when we realized it's not about being perfectly managed. It's not enough to build a great organization. You have to use this concept of leverage, and you have to get outside your 4 walls and figure out how you inspire and engage others to become part of your cause. So we found 6 practices, and I'm going to go through each of these very quickly in the interest of time. I want to make sure and leave time for some of your questions. So I'm going to just give you a quick example and explain each practice, and then we can go deeper on any one of them during the Q&A period. And I'm also happy to answer questions afterward when I'm doing the book signing as well. The first practice we found really had to do with the power of advocacy. Most nonprofits get into this work because they see an unmet need and they start meeting that need. They start performing a basic service. So in America's Second Harvest case, Feeding America's case, it's feeding hungry people. In Habitat's case, it was building houses for people who didn't have homes, right? And yet over time, all of these organizations figured out that they could only have more leverage and more impact if they eventually got involved with policy advocacy, even the ones that were initially quite hesitant to do so. America's Second Harvest said for years, we don't want to do policy advocacy. It's politics, it's messy, and so on. But it was only when Congress was threatening to cut back emergency food assistance programs and slash hundreds of millions of dollars in the mid-1990s that they realized we have to stand up and defend these programs, because if we don't, we're going to have more hungry people showing up on our doorstep. Or Self-Help Credit Union, which we write about in the book, a lending agency down in rural North Carolina, providing loans to families starting out from low-income backgrounds to buy their first home or start a business and to build economic assets. Well, they discovered in the early 2000s, they had an African-American school bus driver come into their offices with some loan papers. He'd refinanced his home up the road with a lender who he didn't know, and it turns out he owed almost double the amount of his original loan. When they looked at the papers, they were shocked. They found out the lender had actually tacked on an additional 50% in credit insurance and fees, virtually ensuring that this man was going to default on his home. Well, we all know how that story ends, and unfortunately not well, right? This was the tip of the iceberg of the predatory lending movement in America, and self-help was one of the first ones to start to mobilize and advocate to change legislation. They've passed anti-predatory lending legislation in more than 23 states in just the last few years. And while it wasn't enough for one nonprofit to stop the meltdown of all of the financial lending markets and Wall Street, they are at the forefront of reform and making sure this kind of thing does not happen again. So by engaging in policy advocacy, they're having far more impact at a national level than they could do if they just stayed in their own community and continued providing basic services. The second practice we found really had to do with the power of engaging and mobilizing the resources of the private sector. Fred Krupp is the executive director of Environmental Defense Fund. He's actually been there almost 30 years. It was back in the 1980s when he was sitting in a McDonald's with his kids, and they'd just eaten Happy Meals. You know, I have a 5-year-old, so anybody who has kids or grandkids knows how much trash those Happy Meals can generate. And Fred and his 8-year-old son decided to write a letter to the CEO of McDonald's. He said, here I am running this environmental organization, and you guys are just churning out more and more trash and trying to get more and more market share every year. You know, we want to come help you figure out what to do about this. So amazingly, the CEO of McDonald's accepted. They had a conversation, and it led to a 2-year task force where McDonald's and Environmental Defense Fund's senior scientists and engineers worked with McDonald's to figure out how to reduce their packaging waste. They switched from styrofoam clamshells, remember those back in the 80s, to recycled cardboard packaging, and reduced their overall packaging waste by more than 150,000 metric tons. Not only that, but every other fast food restaurant copied McDonald's because McDonald's was suddenly getting credit with consumers for being more socially responsible and green. And by the way, it reduced their cost. So Fred Krupp realized that we can't treat business as the enemy. We need to work with business to help them figure out how they can become more sustainable. They now have offices in Bentonville, Arkansas. They're working with Walmart. They're working with FedEx on their mid-sized truck fleet. They've gone on to work with corporations all over the country on changing their business practices. And what was so surprising about this at the time, environmental defense took a ton of flack from other environmentalists in the green movement. David Brower accused them of doing a deal with the devil when they started working with McDonald's. And in fact, for the first 15 years, environmental defense's informal motto was "Sue the bastards." I'm sure they didn't put that on their business cards or their marketing materials. But they switched from being completely opposed to business and suing them to realizing we've got to sit down with these guys and figure out how to help make their companies more sustainable. So it was an insight that many of these organizations came to over time, whether it was helping businesses become more sustainable or partnering with them, as City Year has done, to leverage the resources in terms of in-kind and financial donations, or even starting and running earned income ventures. These nonprofits have all figured out how to harness market forces for social change. The third practice we found has to do with inspiring evangelists. For any of you who know who this guy is, this picture was taken a couple years ago before he got sick, but Steve Jobs of Apple Computer is known for, in the tech world out in Silicon Valley, known for inspiring real product evangelists. In fact, a few years ago when the first iPhone came out, my husband's an engineer and a techie, and he loves gadgets. So when the first iPhone came out, I thought, it was right around his birthday, I thought, oh, I'm going to go down and buy one. So I went down to the store about 2 hours before they launched the new iPhone. Lo and behold, I get to Stanford Mall, and there's a line that wraps twice around the mall, and there are people there with like sleeping bags and pillows who've been camped out overnight waiting to buy the iPhone. I waited a week and then went back. But the same way Steve Jobs has been able to inspire technology evangelists and evangelists for his products, in the social sector, we have evangelists of our own who are able to inspire others to join the cause. And I like to say the equivalent in our sector is Jimmy Carter and the role he's played for Habitat for Humanity. So some people even think Habitat was founded by Jimmy Carter. In fact, it was founded by Millard Fuller, who just passed away last year. He and his wife, he'd been a successful businessman. They were having some marital problems, so they renounced all their money, moved to a small religious community in rural Georgia, and that's where the idea of serving the poor and building houses came about. They launched Habitat, and it was doing pretty well. They'd built some houses in Africa. They were working in rural areas in the South. And about 5 years into their founding, Millard Fuller, being a smart marketing man, said, we need somebody who can help us take this to the next level. He went and recruited Jimmy Carter to get involved. Jimmy and Rosalind went out and built a house, and they had that transformational experience where you work side by side with the homeowner to build that home. It's concrete, it's tangible. You really get to know the person who's never had their own home to live in. And they were so transformed that he agreed to join the board. From the time he joined the board to a decade later, Habitat went from a budget of $3 million to a budget of $100 million. Jimmy Carter was able to open doors for the organization, sign their direct mail campaigns, help them in countless ways. But it's not just about having the super evangelists, lest you all think you've got to go get Demi Moore on your board or Angelina Jolie. It's actually about the everyday evangelists. And what we found is that the volunteers of these organizations were so connected to that nonprofit that they really became ambassadors for that cause as well. It was all about giving people concrete experiences with your mission telling your story in an engaging way and keeping them connected. We have all kinds of ways to connect online now, but it's not just about online connection. It's also about face-to-face connection and the importance of bringing people together and giving them those real experiences on the ground with what it is you're doing. So you might think, well, okay, not every organization like Habitat is building houses. Teach for America was very creative. They realized that in addition to engaging the core members that they put in schools, they had to figure out how to engage their other supporters and donors as well. So they created Teach Week. So everybody from Oprah Winfrey to Laura Bush has now gone in and taught a class during Teach Week. Any one of their major supporters can go in and actually teach a class, because what better way to understand the mission of what Teach for America is doing than to actually go in and teach a class and be in front of those kids and empathize with what those teachers go through every day. So when you think about your organizations, think about how you're inspiring evangelists for your cause, how you're really getting them engaged with your mission, not just writing checks, but what are you doing to get them to participate and to become advocates for your cause? In the same way these organizations inspire individual evangelists and build social networks, they also build organizational networks. And I think this is one of the big themes that you're here at this conference to discuss, is how do you create these connections across organizations? I think too often it's easy to fall into a mindset of, well, these other organizations are competing for the same donor dollars, or they're competing for mind share. And, you know, it's too easy for us in some ways to emulate the private sector. But you know what? In the nonprofit sector, we're all better off if we collaborate rather than compete. That was the key insight of Dorothy Stoneman, who founded Youth Build. And when she had started Youth Build in New York City to work with high school dropouts to give them job skills, to have them work on building low-income housing, get their GEDs, and become productive members of society rather than dropouts, the model was so successful, she was looking to scale up nationally, and she hired a consultant, one who probably had an MBA and who came in and said, Dorothy, these other youth groups, they're your competition, right? They're competing for the same donor dollars, and you need to differentiate. Well, Dorothy Stoneman was a good community organizer. She said, don't be ridiculous. They're our allies. We are all trying to create better outcomes and better lives for young people in America. So like any good community organizer, she organized them. She went around and organized youth programs all over the country, and together they lobbied Congress and got more than $100 million in appropriations for the Youth Build model to be spread throughout the country. So by choosing not to control her model and to collaborate rather than compete, she was able to scale up much more quickly. The Exploratorium has a similar story where they spread their model by sharing what it was they were doing. Rather than hoarding their intellectual property, they gave their model away to anybody from anywhere in the world that wanted to start an interactive science or technology museum. They actually paid people to come to the Exploratorium in San Francisco and study it. So through this open source approach, they've actually created a network of more than 600 museums globally. So when you think about your own organization, think about how it is you're collaborating with others. How is it that you're working together? Are you sharing resources? Are you thinking about ways that you could be more efficient and coordinate your services better by forming a local network? We at the Monitor Institute are doing a lot of research on networks and collaboration in the social sector, because I think this really is the next frontier of our work. We've spent the last 20 years thinking about how we build sustainable organizations, and that's really important, but it's equally important to actually start to look at, with all of these small nonprofits that are below scale, how do we actually start to build networks so we can start solving the problem at the scale of the problem, right? And that can only happen by creating these connections. So I'm not going to spend more time on it here, but we do have a blog which has countless resources on network building and collaboration for nonprofits, and the URL is www.workingwically.net. If you just Google Working Wically, you'll find it. We've written some things about it, and we've worked with the Packard Foundation over the last 2 years, and again, we have a huge resource directory. So for those of you really interested in this piece around building networks and figuring out how to create high-functioning networks, there are a lot of resources there. Yes?
What is that website again?
So it's www.workingwicily, W-I-K-I-L-Y. I know it's very confusing. It's a blog, but we used wiki in the title, so it's confusing, but workingwicily.net. So these organizations all work outside their boundaries to engage all 4 sectors, but to do this really well, we found 2 additional practices of what they do on the inside. When we went into them and we were studying them initially, we wanted to understand what role did culture play, and were these organizations, was there any kind of common culture? Well, they were all entrepreneurial and innovative, for sure. But some of them were much more buttoned down and obsessed with data. Teach for America measures everything they can measure. Heritage Foundation has strategy consultants. They spend, one day every quarter doing strategic planning, having offsites. And if you walk into the Heritage Foundation's offices, it looks like a blue chip corporation on Capitol Hill. So we jokingly called these organizations the MBAs. But then there was another group in our sample. They weren't so buttoned down. They were kind of creative and freewheeling. And for them, plan was a 4-letter word. We called them the free spirits. What was interesting is regardless of where they were on the spectrum, some were much more innovative and creative, some were much more buttoned down and relied on data, but they all figured out how to master the cycle of adaptation. They figured out how to take feedback, listen to their environment, get feedback from their clients, their other stakeholders to understand changes in the environment, then to experiment and innovate with new programs. So they were never content just to rest on their laurels and say, well, we've got this great program, we just need to keep doing more of it. They were constantly figuring out new ways to work, ways to make incremental improvements to their programs, or ways to develop new programs so that they could constantly have more impact. They would then evaluate and learn what works, and at the end of the day, they would modify their programs and plans. So in many cases, this is like what Jim Collins says about having a stop doing list. We saw countless examples in these nonprofits of programs that they had decided to shut down because they'd moved in new directions. And that was okay because that freed up resources to direct to higher impact programs. I think particularly in this economy, in a resource-constrained environment, it's important to think about how adaptive are we and how able are we to really make hard choices about what's getting us the impact and what's not working so well. And maybe we need to redeploy those resources. And then the last practice in the book really has to do with the importance of sharing leadership. Now, I'm sure there are many executive directors. Raise your hand if you're an executive director. Okay, there are a lot of executive directors. I like to say that executive directors kind of have the impossible job. So we expect them not only to deal with things like program and finance and administration and hiring and firing staff, but they also have to go out and lobby and build corporate partnerships and manage their board and inspire evangelists and create movements. That sounds like about 4 or 5 jobs to me. What we found in these organizations is that many of them had long tenured leaders who had been there for sometimes 20 or 30 years. More than half of them were still founder-led. And when we first looked at it, we thought, uh-oh, founder syndrome. But in this case, it wasn't founder syndrome at all. What enabled these leaders to stay was the fact that they had figured out how to share power and build leaderful organizations. The average tenure for EDs in this sector is 4 years. Compass Point data. And the reason is, and you all know who are sitting in that job, because it's an incredibly difficult job. We expect so much of our EDs, right? And because funders and boards tend to drive them nuts. So those are the reasons that people often quit the ED job. What we found was that the boards and the executive directors and the senior teams all had terrifically collaborative working relationships where they all were taking responsibility for leading the organization and supporting the organization. And rather than this kind of outdated hierarchical model, which I think many of us have in our heads, where the board hires and fires the ED and probably meddles in micromanagement, and the ED hires and fires the executive team, we actually saw something that looked more like 3 legs of a triangle, where there was clarity about roles, but there was a willingness to share power and to share leadership within the organization. And these executive directors had figured out how to build really strong teams, appointing a COO. Almost all of them had a COO to focus on the internal management, so they could be freed up to do more of the external facing. And large teams of senior executives who were really empowered to lead in the organization. So when you think about your own organizations, think about what you're doing to build your leadership capacity, and to not just in your organization, but in your network as well. And then the last chapter in the book really has to do with what do you do to sustain this impact? Now, I've talked a little bit about the importance of building sustainable organizations, but what we found is these groups were willing to invest in their overhead and their capacity, even when it was unpopular with funders. America's Second Harvest had to go out and raise $40 million to upgrade their food banks and their trucks and to develop refrigerated capacity so they could transport produce from one side of the country to the other. As the food industry has shifted from canned and tinned goods to more fresh produce, America's Second Harvest had to figure out how to upgrade all of their equipment. Well, of course, you go to funders and say, we want $40 million for technology. They're going to be like, that's overhead, that's capacity. We don't want to fund that. They got a lot of pushback, but they persevered, and they said to ConAgra, who made a lead grant, you know what? I know you guys want to fund the kids' cafes and the kids' backpacks program because it's sexy, but if we don't have the refrigerated trucks and warehouses, we're not going to be able to get the food to the kids. So they made the strategic argument why this investment was critical to their ability to deliver on their success. And as a consequence, many of these organizations don't fare so well with traditional charity ratings. I'm pleased to announce that actually this data was from 2 years ago, but the new director of Charity Navigator is looking at changing their measurement system, not just because of us, but because of increasing pressure and a recognition that we can't just penalize nonprofits for investing in the things that they need to do to build strong and healthy organizations. We actually need to look at outcomes and outputs and what's the return we get on that investment, not how much money did you spend on your staff or your computers. So when you think about what it takes to sustain your nonprofit, the three obvious things are you need to find sustainable sources of funding, and all of these nonprofits have figured that out in part because they had so many allies in different sectors. They had diversified funding bases. They invest in their people, and they invest in their infrastructure. So I have a couple slides in here about the economy, and I'm just going to skip through them very quickly because I wanted to leave at least a few minutes for questions, and we got a little bit of a late start. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly. There's nothing in here you don't already know. It's been really bad the last year. We see this with all of our clients, and I know that it's been a really difficult time for nonprofits all over the country. Foundations, endowments have been dropping, individuals have cut back and are not giving as much, and nonprofits are feeling the pinch. This is data from nonprofits in Minnesota, but if you just look at this, I'm curious actually, how many of you have either cut staff or reduced your operating budget or put expansion plans on hold in the last year? Yeah, so it's been a very difficult time for all of us who are trying to meet rising demands in the community. But the silver lining to this is that it's not the end of the world. When we actually went back and we looked at where the market was vis-a-vis historic positions, we've had 4 or 5 years of incredibly strong growth leading up to this point. And the president of the Hewlett Foundation said this just puts our foundation budget back to where we were in 2005, and we thought of ourselves as big then. So it is a setback, but it's not the end of the world. The other interesting thing was that we found that historically giving, both individual giving and foundation giving, tends to follow the market up. And while it might flatten off or dip slightly, it doesn't go back down to the same extent that the market's gone down. So if you look at historical dips in the market back in 1987 and 2001, giving flattened out, but then it actually recovered and started to go back up again, which I think is reassuring. I mean, we know the future is uncertain, the market is looking stronger, things have started to turn around, but I know that next year is also going to be tough because in many ways the social sector lags what's happening in the private sector, right? So I think you're going to see foundations maybe making cuts next year more than even this year. So I think the real question is, how do these practices apply in this current economic environment? And I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, as I said, it's a great time to adapt. This is the time to figure out which programs are not getting you enough impact and to really focus on what you're good at. It's also a great time for organizations that are in the right industries to be advocating for federal funding. With the stimulus package, with the Department of Education's Race to the Top, with the new Learn and Serve America Act, there's a lot of federal money out there for organizations that are well positioned to apply for it. Strengthening private partnerships. While businesses might be hurting right now, and they may not have money to give you, I can guarantee you that if you can go in there and help it boost their employee morale, if you can get their folks volunteering in your organization, if you can double down on building your relationship, these are the corporate partners that will come back in spades when the economy recovers. And it's a terrific time to actually be engaging your evangelists, to really rally your board, to rally your supporters and donors, to rally your volunteers. In fact, what we've seen in Silicon Valley, and I don't know what it's like here, but we've actually seen this is a great time for nonprofits to be hiring and even getting people to work for free, because there are so many technology workers and people with, PhDs and amazing resumes who are unemployed right now, and they're like, just give me something to do. I want to help out. I don't want to just sit at home and be depressed. So it's actually a great time to be recruiting and managing and engaging new volunteers for your organization. And it's also a terrific time, as you know, to be connecting and coordinating. This is the time to figure out how can we work more efficiently by working together rather than competing against one another. Sharing leadership and figuring out how even in a downturn you continue to strengthen the leadership within your organization. And then sometimes, how do you even think about investing for the long run, investing in your infrastructure for those organizations that have the luxury to think about, okay, well now may be the time to actually think about longer term strategies and investments so we can come out of this recession stronger rather than weaker. And I'll just end on this quote that I find inspiring, but it says that there's an opportunity for nonprofits and philanthropies to deepen community ties and commitments and reinforce a sense of common cause, to breathe life into community volunteerism, which may have faltered as everyone chased the brass ring of seemingly limitless credit. Now is the time and the opportunity for significant growth to build volunteer networks, to bring community leaders into nonprofit boards and programs, and to become the people partners of public finance. The federal government may bring the money, but the nonprofit sector can bring engagement. So I think the real lesson here is that we must resolve to be the masters, not the victims of our destiny. And I hope that if you take some of the practices that I've shared with you today about these 12 high-impact nonprofit organizations, that you'll leave here today and after the next 2 days with some strategies for figuring out how you can take that control back and not become victims, but be to the masters of your own destiny and have significantly more impact in your communities. So I want to thank you, and I'd like to take just a couple of questions, and then I'd be happy to answer more questions during the break at the book signing. Anybody who has a question? Yes. Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. We get asked that all the time. And our publisher calls us up, once a month and says, here's what we're doing. We decided that it didn't make sense to write a whole new book. What we are doing is we're actually starting to write a last chapter in the book, which is applying these practices to small nonprofit organizations to deepen their impact locally. And that chapter will come out in a re-released, updated edition probably next fall. So we're just doing the research and starting to write now, and our publisher is going to re-release Forces for Good probably in the fall, which will be the 3rd year anniversary of when the book first came out. So stay tuned. Anyone else? Yes?
Montana is probably one of the most isolated state in the lower 48 states. We're a whole state away from any major metropolitan area. One of the challenges we have is that there's never been enough money in the system. The executive directors are underpaid, the organizations are underfunded, and the work is just overwhelming sometimes. What thoughts do you have about what organizations can do in Montana to try to overcome some of those deficiencies or challenges?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, this whole capital markets problem, I feel like you guys may have it worse, but it's a problem for nonprofits all over the country, right? There just aren't high-functioning capital markets for the nonprofit sector the same way they are in the private sector. So there are people who are looking at that and trying to figure out creative new ways to bring more money and more resources into the sector. I actually think this point about coordinating and becoming more efficient and looking at whether it's mergers or joint ventures or partnerships, how can you use the resources you have more effectively as a starting point? We've had significant growth in this sector. This nonprofit sector has doubled in size in the last 10 years. And, I'm not sure that growth is sustainable, right? So I think rather than, I'm all in favor of social entrepreneurship and innovation and new ideas, but at the same time, I also think we need to sometimes, rather than supporting somebody down the street who wants to go start yet another homeless shelter, say, wait a second, there's already 3 of those in our community, and you should work with these other guys rather than starting your own. So in some ways, I actually feel like we've had too much growth. And we need to look at how do we now take the organizations that exist, help them coordinate, and collaborate so that they can have more impact. Beyond that, I think looking at creative funding techniques, program-related investments. I know Tom Siebel invested a lot here. I wonder if there are other high net worth individuals who have vacation homes, second homes, et cetera, if you can get them engaged in the state with their philanthropy. There's a few ideas. Anyone else? Okay, why don't we go to break? I know people probably want their cup of coffee, and as I said, I'm happy to sign books and answer more questions during the break in the book resource area.
Thank you, Heather. Before you go, we do have something for you that we want to give to you. It's in Montana. I think many of you here probably know it's the centennial anniversary of Glacier National Park. So we've got the First Love 100 years about Glacier National Parks for Heather. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
And Heather will be available to sign books. We have Forces for Good is in the book fair. We're off and running. Thank you, folks. We'll see you at lunchtime.